Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me for one of our regular remote media avails. Lots to talk about. I want to get to all of your questions, but wanted to note that today is actually the 12th anniversary of the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Um, you know, with all that's going on today, the fact that this was 12 years ago, we'd gone through what was also at that point a very challenging legislative time, but put a major law on the books around health care that's helped many millions of Virginians get access to health care. It's also been, it was obviously a bill that had a lot of challenges on implementation, and I think reflects the fact that Congress never gets it 100% right the first time, and like so many major pieces of legislation, has taken a while to get fully implemented. And clearly, I think even some of its most ardent opponents still believe that, or recognize at this point, 12 years in, that this has been an important step forward on health care. One of the reasons why, as we think later in the conversation, we talk to, going forward, I do hope that we can revisit some of the issues around prescription drugs, an issue that was frankly not addressed in the Affordable Care Act. And as somebody who's got a member of my family with a type 1 diabetes, this notion of putting in place law finally that would allow negotiation for drug prices, but specifically cap expenses for any family at $35 a month for their insulin is long overdue, and hopefully something that will come up on the insulin, at least on a bipartisan basis in the next in the coming weeks. Obviously, what has dominated my time is both as not only overall as a senator, but particularly as Intelligence Committee chair, has been the war in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin's literally punishing displacement now of close to 10 million Ukrainians, 6.5 million of them roughly within Ukraine, another 3.5 million people that have had to flee the country. We're seeing the Ukrainians respond in an extraordinary way. Great stories in the last couple of days about some of the successes of the Ukrainian Air Force against the Russians, the constant pressure that the Ukrainians have kept on the Russian invading forces, the fact that Putin has not been successful, and unfortunately we're seeing now the Russian military turn a lot of its focus towards the kind of steady bombardment of civilian as well as military targets that candidly I think are bone-chilling to all of us watching this, not only here in America and around the world. And my hope is, as President Biden goes to NATO, that we can extend the sanctions regime. I frankly think most, if not all, members of the Russian parliament, the Duma, ought to be sanctioned. I think senior military officers who are involved in this invasion or committing war crimes need to be sanctioned. So we need to continue the economic sanctions. We need to ratchet up some of the personal sanctions, and we need to continue to get the Ukrainian forces the military assistance they need. We're over 20,000 anti-tank missiles tools that we and our allies have put forward. The SA-300s, a very advanced system, Russian-made actually, are now being transferred from Slovakia. This will be able, again, ground-to-air efforts that I think can take out Russian planes at high altitudes. And what will be extraordinarily important for President Biden to put forward is to maintain the unity of NATO. This is a trip for him in terms of the Ukraine circumstance, even in addition to the questions of his visit to Poland. There is a NATO summit, a EU summit, and a G7 summit. So all of the Western world leaders, not just European, but with G7, including our friends in Japan, to make sure that we can keep the pressure on. And obviously one of the things that I hope our European allies will move forward on as well is stronger ability to cut off Russian sources of oil and gas. It's a lot more difficult for our Europeans who rely more on those sources, but I think it's important that we if we're going to put crippling sanctions on the Russian economy, we have to go after their oil and gas as well. We have done that in this country, and hopefully we can work with our European allies to extend that. I would point out that one of the things that didn't get a lot of attention is that the Biden administration has recently approved, I believe, 2 additional LNG export facilities. One of the ways that we can help our Europeans wean themselves off, particularly Russian gas, if we can take the abundance of American gas production that we've created, liquefy it, and ship it to our European allies. So NATO, big issue. Connected with that, and the president's made this morning in terms of increased levels of awareness for American industry. I think it is probably safe to say that we should anticipate that you will see Russian activity in the cyber domain directed against the West. This is something I know we visited on a number of times already, that it's been kind of the dog that didn't bark in terms of Russia really completely shutting down the internet in Ukraine. I'm amazed, and again, complimentary to all of the journalists who continue to get these reports out. I think that's probably undermined Putin's activities as much as anything, and the fact that the Russians have not gone ahead, shut down the internet, shut down all of the networks across Ukraine has surprised us. But as the president laid out recently, we should anticipate that Russians may up some of their cyber activities against certain sectors in the American economy. Financial sector, our own energy sector, and whether this takes the form of the top flight Russian GRU and other sources, or takes the form of kind of unlimited ransomware attacks, that will probably be in our immediate future. One of the things, again, that's important, I'm very proud of the fact that my bill was included in the budget that finally requires mandatory cyber reporting. This is so important. Right now, only about 30% of the cyber attacks are actually reported to the government. We need that information not only to go after the bad guys, but particularly to also share it with other private sector partners. We know that 80-90% of our critical infrastructure in this country is in the hands of the private sector. We've got to share that information real time with our private sector partners. Something I've also been following more as an observer, since I'm not on the Judiciary Committee, and that's the nomination hearings of Judge Jackson. I think she's done a great job so far. I look forward to, I believe I have scheduled early next week, an individual meeting with her. But I think she is so far showing both the judicial temperament, background, and experience that will put her in the mainstream of a Supreme Court judge that, again, I look forward to supporting, unless there is some dramatic new information that would come out. I want to close before we turn it over to Laura with the questions on the issue of another bill that I've been working on for some time that I think hits on a variety of fronts. And this is a bill that constantly, its name changes. It was initially called USICTA it was originally called Endless Frontiers. So I think we're calling it kind of the America Competes Act at this point. It passed the Senate back in last July, 68 votes, $52 billion, particularly for semiconductors and next generation wireless, the so-called 5G and O-RAN. Really, really important. House passed a version that had other extraneous activities. We're now moving towards conference to make sure we can get this bill to the president's desk. And if there's ever a piece of legislation that should be a no-brainer, this goes to national security. Who controls the semiconductor industry? Semiconductors are in virtually any product, device that has an on and off switch. We've seen a lot of that semiconductor production move to China. Already a lot of it exists in Taiwan, and when we see the ramifications of the Ukraine-Russia war, obviously the challenges around Taiwan escalate, and I think most folks' mindset, if somehow China were able to take over Taiwan, that would eliminate, particularly in terms of cutting-edge semiconductors, a lot of our supply, and for that matter, the West supply. So national security, we need to make this $52 billion investment in semiconductor facilities. That would add at least 10 new fabrication facilities here in this country. I feel very good about the chances that at least one of those fabrication facilities might end up in Virginia. So it is a national security issue. It's a jobs issue. We've already seen Intel. I met with the CEO of Intel just yesterday. He's already announced a new facility in Ohio that literally, I think, had close to 10,000 jobs connected with it. Tens and tens of billions of dollars worth of investments. So this is a jobs bill. It's a national security bill. It is also a bill in terms of inflation and supply chain. The biggest challenge we faced right now in the fastest growing part of inflation, even beyond gas prices, is the rise of automobile costs, both new and used. Part of that is because the auto industry can't get enough of the new cars made. They're made, but they're lacking semiconductor chips. And while passing this legislation won't immediately relieve that supply chain problem, it will send both a market signal and have us start creating the long-term domestic supply chain that we need for this critical industry. National security, jobs, standing up against China, and obviously taking on inflation and the supply chain as well. All efforts to make sure that we get this important piece of legislation resolved and to the president's desk. So why don't I stop there? And Laura, why don't we go ahead and take some of these questions?
Our first question will be with Hannah Brandt with Nexstar.
Hi there. Thanks for taking my question. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the issue of cybersecurity. I know this is something you've been working on. What more do you think lawmakers need to be doing to prepare? And then is there a risk that if Russia launches cyber attacks against us, that we retaliate and then kind of enter into this cyber war with Russia?
That's a great question. On the legislative front, the area that I think Congress needs to take up next, although it won't be taken up, I think, in a timely enough manner to affect the current crisis with Ukraine and Russia, but that is by critical infrastructure areas, finance, energy and gas, telecom, healthcare, hospitals, that each of these respective industries set some level of minimum standards. And I've been working on some legislative activity in that way, particularly around the healthcare field. The challenge is that if the bad guys can penetrate a company in any of those domains, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And as we saw with the SolarWinds attack a couple years ago, got into a supply chain, literally got into 18,000 companies. Now that didn't end up, the malware didn't affect all 18,000 because the Russians were very selective about which companies they went after. But it shows the challenges that you're only as strong as your weakest link. So I do think we need some legislated minimum cyber hygiene standards for each of these areas. That, again, won't take place immediately. The challenge around, could cyber escalation literally lead to military conflict? And that is an open question. I've been concerned for some time that if Russia would have launched their most sophisticated cyber attacks in Ukraine, and similar to what was called the NotPetya attack they launched against Ukraine in 2017, where literally once you let some of these cyber weapons into the wild, they don't respect geographic boundaries or networks themselves. They go from one network to another. And I was concerned for some time that shutting down systems in Ukraine might bleed into Poland or other NATO countries that could cause loss of life, that could then create the potential for an Article 5 violation that would require then all of the 30 NATO nations to step up against that kind of cyber attack. One of the reasons why this field has really, we're kind of still in a gray area. We've never seen what cyber escalation looks like. I can tell you that both the United States and Russia has hundreds, if not thousands, of extraordinarily sophisticated cyber tools. And I think it is one of the areas, and perhaps, we're still looking for a reason why Putin hasn't launched more of these tools. It may be one area that he's showing some restraint because he doesn't know, once you let some of these weapons into the wild, where that escalation could end up with. But as we see Putin more and more isolated, and being less successful on the battlefield, this possibility is real. And I think it was important that the president, once again, say to our top businesses, you need to have your systems up. We also need to get this report of cyber attacks real time, because the truth is, more likely than not, particularly if the Russians bring their top cyber offensive tools, they may get into some of our systems. So we can't be 100% effective on defense. We've got to then make sure that we find out where the attack is, cut it off, and get our networks back up. So resilience is much as important as actually cyber defense. So sorry about that long answer. Obviously, this is a field, as both chair of the Intelligence Committee and as chair of the Cyber Caucus, that I'm very, very focused on.
Our next question will be with John Dowding with Wavy.
Hey, good morning, Senator. Thanks for joining us today. I want to talk about some things going on here locally in Hampton Roads in Virginia. I'm sure you saw over the weekend, I saw you tweeted about it, that we lost a media professional here in a shooting in Norfolk. She was a reporter for the Virginia Pilot and Daily Press. Obviously, she was just one of four individuals over the weekend who was shot, who was killed, and 15 people who were shot within 5 cities here in Hampton Roads in a 24-hour period.
Yeah, it's true.
I wanted to ask, one, on behalf of everybody in the area here, we're still grieving and dealing and reeling with all of this, but it's becoming an all too familiar narrative. And obviously, and this isn't just a Virginia issue or a Hampton Roads issue, but two things here. One, I just want to know, what were your initial reactions to hearing about this? Because this is, first warm weekend that we had here. And two, what's going on at the federal level to provide resources to localities and states so they can start implementing gun violence intervention programs and other types of programs? Just last night, Norfolk City Council was talking about introducing an violence intervention program from Newark, New Jersey. But what funding and resources are y'all working at the federal level to provide locally across the country and to other states?
Well, again, I was horrified by the brutality of the shootings, the irony, the fact that the Virginia Pilot reporter was going to be called to cover the shooting when she ended up being a victim. I don't even want to use the hearts and prayers line, because I think most folks in Hampton Roads, most folks in Virginia, most folks in America are tired of politicians say, send you our thoughts and prayers and then don't do anything. The fact that we at the federal level can't put in place sensible gun safety, gun restrictions, universal background checks, thank goodness in Virginia. The last General Assembly and the last governor put some of those appropriate gun safety restrictions in place. I think we need to do it at the federal level as well. There was in the budget that the president just signed plus-ups for the Justice Department programs, so that whether there's a good program from Newark that needs to be implemented in Norfolk, we got to take best practices from around the country, have them implemented. I was happy to see as well that there was a gun buyback initiative that was done locally, and I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 guns, 50 guns got returned. But it's going to take not just all of government, but all of community effort. Anti-gun violence programs, more community activities to particularly get young people alternative venues on where you don't have particularly very young people both exposed to firearms and then with nothing to do, where you end up with these kind of violent outbreaks taking place. But it is going to require, there will be the funding available at the federal level, but I frankly think this needs a more united federal response, and hearts and prayers are just not enough.
We're going to move on to Jim Spencer with the Daily Progress.
Senator, thanks for taking the call. I'm curious about I think I'm just going to change this. In Charlottesville, they had a shooting over the weekend where 120 rounds were fired in about a minute. And that was at a fundraiser for a street intervention group like the Interrupters and the folks who are coming out of Newark to Norfolk. What is, in your mind, the issue here with guns? The girl that was killed, the young woman who was killed in Norfolk was killed in a dispute over a drink or something like that. And in Charlottesville, a bunch of people went out into a parking lot. There were 5 different calibers of weapons and 120 rounds fired. What's wrong with us, basically, in terms of why we go straight to violence in situations like this, as far as you're concerned? And is there anything we can do?
Well, this is something not just Virginia, but our country wrestles with on a, unfortunately, almost regular basis. And it feels we get these spurts of violence, and it almost is like the vast majority of us are somewhat immune to these horrific examples. I do think, and there's no single gun safety or gun control legislation that's going to stop all of this violence. But the data is extraordinarily clear that those states who have put in place responsible gun laws, universal background checks, some level of limitations on the size of some of these magazines, there's just less death by firearms in those states. So if we can prevent any with some level of reasonable restrictions, I say this is a Second Amendment supporter. I say this is somebody who owns shotguns and handguns myself. There are reasonable restrictions that can be put in place that don't interfere, I believe, with Second Amendment rights. We also, I don't know the secret formula that's going to convince folks, particularly young people, not to immediately resort to violence. If some of these programs have had a better track record, I think we probably do need to do a better job of some level of national review of what works. Many times the success of these programs are driven by the passion of the actual organizer, and in many cases, former gang members themselves in certain times who've come back and have a better ability to speak to preventing violence. I also think it's one of the reasons why we need to continue, obviously, to fund the police and give them the tools they need to keep our communities safe. And I think funding the police and at the same time having the police make sure they respect the rights of those who they serve is not contradictory at all. So I think it's going to take rational, reasonable restrictions, particularly on some of these access to firearms, particularly for folks who've got criminal records, universal background checks. I think it's going to take a better examination of some of the gun violence and overall violence prevention programs that have got a track record. I think it's going to take strong support for law enforcement, and it's going to take, obviously, whole community involvement. But this is a tragedy that repeats itself way too many times in this country.
We're going to move on to Allison Graham with the Roanoke Times.
Hi, thanks so much. I wanted to ask about the Air Commission report concerning the Veterans Affairs hospitals. I'm specifically down in Roanoke writing about the Salem, Virginia Medical Center, and I was wondering, is there a concern that the closure of these hospitals could lead to an access to care issue for veterans? I know it's been brought up by their union about privatizing or closing some of these hospitals.
First of all, I don't support privatizing the Veterans Administration. I think we need to honor our commitment to veterans, whether it is in Southwest Virginia with the Salem facility, whether it's McGuire in the Richmond and Central Virginia, or the facility at Hampton, some of the new facilities being put in the Fredericksburg area. And this report was really just kind of the first step in examining how we create a VA that's going to really work effectively for the 21st century. A lot of our VA facilities are old. They need improvement. But I don't think anyone should believe that some of the recommendations that came out of this report are going to be necessarily even fully implemented. This is a suggestion, and as was pointed out with the Salem facility, I believe it was not going to be eliminated, it was going to be replaced. these things take a long time as well. I will tell you, as somebody who's been very active in building new facilities in the Fredericksburg area with a lot of growth, and on the south side in Hampton Roads, we are 6 years in, 7 years in, and we're still a year or two away from actually the opening of these new facilities. So none of this is going to happen overnight. And one of the things I'm going to look for is local veterans input, community input, in terms of how much of this report ought to be accepted, and how we make sure that we, again, first and foremost, maintain the quality of the VA and honor that commitment to veterans. One of the things that I still, has some challenges with, and I saw this at the Salem VA, although it got better, was in certain cases the systems are so old, like the telephone systems, for example, that you've got veteran wait times on appointments that are just frankly not acceptable. And in some of those cases, a new facility with upgraded technology may in the long run provide both better care and frankly at a more affordable rate than simply constantly patching old systems. But I want to assure everybody in the Roanoke area, none of this is going to happen overnight. None of this is going to happen without your input and your ideas. And at the end of the day, anything that would change has to result in better, quicker, and more accessible care for our veterans.
Our next question will be with Mitchell Miller with WTOP.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for joining us. I wanted to ask you a question going back to Ukraine. As you're aware, NATO is poised to announce more forces are going to be moved, military forces, toward the eastern part toward Ukraine. Do you favor that, and do you think the U.S., especially with Virginia having a large military presence, should be ready to also be ready to bolster military presence in connection with what's going on?
We have already seen the United States dramatically increase its presence in Europe and forward deployed some of our forces, for example, to Poland. I believe we're now close to 100,000 troops, American troops alone, not counting the other 30 NATO nations, that are on the ground or in the process of being on the ground in Europe. And yes, some of those forces need to be forward deployed in the Baltics, in Poland, in Romania, Slovakia, all the other nations that are adjacent to Russia and to Ukraine. This is one of the areas, I was critical of the administration on lack of consultation with our allies around Afghanistan. But on this case, a NATO that frankly was basically broken a year ago because of its constant undermining by the former President Trump. This NATO is back stronger than ever. That has required enormous consultation between America and our NATO allies. The fact that they are all shipping equipment and material both to forward positions of our buffer nations, those the Polands of the world, and the vast majority are shipping actual arms to Ukraine, I think has shown how resolute and strong this alliance is. And it's one of the reasons why under no circumstances can we allow Vladimir Putin to be successful. Now, we've got to figure out what that off-ramp is, and I think the Ukrainians have already partially offered that with openness. The Ukrainians' decision, not our decision, but the Ukrainians' decision about some level of neutrality or not wanting to join NATO in any kind of short term, but that ought to be the Ukrainians' decision. But we've got to be resolute, and I think one of the things that President Biden's got to show is he's been very strong about we will protect every square foot of NATO territory. Should Putin violate that directly, I think we know what the unified response will be, but as the earlier question would be on the question of, for example, cyber or, God forbid, a chemical weapons attack that might flow into an adjacent nation, these are areas where I think you're going to see NATO and the president lay out some red lines. So your basic question is, yes, I support moving troops forward deployed, American and other NATO troops, and I point out the fact that we've got close to 100,000 soldiers in Europe now. That is close to 30,000 more than were there in as recently as 2018.
And we have time for one more question with Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwoods.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. As far as the threat of cyber attacks from Russia, I've heard concern from everyday Virginians over online banking, virtual learning for our school kids, and even down to people who rely on online grocery delivery options. Are these areas of concern? And if so, how can Virginians best prepare? If not, how can we quell those very real fears?
Well, I think what we've gotten, particularly in our financial systems, will be resilience. Even if the Russians or the bad guys are somehow able to break into a system, the idea that they could take down an online banking system or any other service that's provided online for an extended period of time, I think we're pretty well prepared on that basis. I do think smaller companies that have never invested in any cyber defense, I think that ought to be revisited. I think there ought to be constant communication. If you see something in cyber, report it. There is something called CISA, the Cyber Information Security Agency, that is not a law enforcement agency, but it is a place where you can report on an anonymous basis, where we will give you immunity. We don't want to penalize the victim. It's one of my cyber reporting bill. But I do think everyday Virginians, what we don't want to create is some cause for panic or some kind of, oh my gosh, I got to go take my money out of the banks. Our systems will be resilient. But this is an area that we are entering into uncharted territory, particularly if we were to see cyber escalation.
All the questions we had. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, everybody. Stay safe. Stay safe.